Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Itachi was interested in having a child. Petunia performs a bit of accidental magic. It says something about her parenting that Uchiha Itachi is considered a better prospect for raising a child. Young Hari is raised by one of the most infamous nukenin of all time and a cadre of uncles whose cumulative effect is very prominent. And someone had the bright idea to bring him back to England. Merlin helps them all. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 11, The Corridor That Isn't Really Worrying in the Least. I will kill you. Hermione threw a copy of Hogwarts, A History at Harry's head. To her dismay, although not surprise, it was dodged and nearly hit Blaze. It skidded on the floor and tripped a Hufflepuff who was too tired to see it in time. She pitched forwards and knocked a companion into a Ravenclaw, spilling several students into the scrambled eggs. Harry cocked his head, not looking around. Why? Look what you did to me. She snarled. I haven't done anything to you recently. You haven't made any further progress in your studies, I admit, but that's not. Hermione bared her teeth at him. Hey, cool. You look like Uncle Kisame. You gave me a ritual that did this. And I look like a freak. You look like my uncle. Although he's a bit of a freak. As I recall, you asked for the ritual, didn't you? I know it didn't say anything about teeth like this. It certainly did. Perfect recall, Hari. I know it didn't. Of course it did. On the second page. Second. I tried to warn you, didn't I? But you didn't want to hear it. Hermione gritted her teeth. They were bright white and all pointed. Each curved slightly inward and had what could best be described as blades on the inner edges. They were also perfectly even. I feel certain I will regret this, said Snape as he walked over. But since you decided to have this discussion at a volume the whole hall could hear, I thought it prudent to find out what you were talking about. He glanced at Hermione. Self-improvement rituals are generally discouraged before 6th year. When Merlin's staff with the knob on the end, what did you do? This is just a guess, said Hari. But I'm thinking it was a ritual to make teeth even or something. I won't bother sending you to hospital, Snape told Hermione. We won't fiddle with ritual magic for a few months at the least. Then we can see if it's settled enough to meddle. He ignored Hermione's tearing eyes. You can try looking around to see if there are any rituals that can undo this. Hermione sniffled and punched Harry's shoulder. Ow. She shook out her hand. It was like hitting aged oak. Shut up. See you tonight then. If you think I'm continuing lessons with you after this, I would be completely right. I don't recall asking you. Hari patted her on the cheek. Don't bite your tongue off and bleed to death, okay? He rose and walked out of the great hall as Pansy began to snicker, only to be smacked by Millicent. Ow. Despite Hermione's resolve not to continue studying with Hari, he was as good as his word. For the next 3 months, she would go to bed and find herself dragged from her sleep and bludgeoned about the head with her wand while she worked on levitating a pebble because Hari wouldn't let her rest until she made progress. The worst part was that she was making progress. She had begun to move the pebble around now, something that should have been impossible for someone without an OWL to do, and that was using a wand. It was infuriating to find that Hari was right about ignoring codified rules for the most part. It was invalidating about 2/3 of the books she'd read on magic. On the other hand, she was beginning to understand the more complex texts on the subject despite her total lack of formal grounding beyond reading. She didn't know the specialized terms, but the elaborate explanation of how magic worked on a more esoteric level was unfolding for her, even if only parts of it made sense. Hari patted Hermione as she dozed off and strolled out of her bedroom. She had made progress despite herself. He was feeling confident that he would manage to get her started on how to properly use magic by the end of the year. Or maybe next. Regardless, he had been meaning to do a bit of investigating into the corridor of not at all scary, and had kept getting distracted by the interesting passageways and so on. But he had finally decided to just deal with it. The dog had apparently gotten wind of his interactions with the dragon, judging from how it tried to back through the wall when he stepped into the corridor. He opened the trapdoor and walked down one side of the shaft, and along the ceiling of the passage down below. There was some sort of plant growing at the bottom of the shaft. Since it looked like something he'd seen in Aunt Conan's art collection, he decided to avoid it by using the walls again. Keys. It was odd, really. He looked at the giant door and frowned. If you wanted to keep someone out, you locked the door, and then kept the key near you, or gave it to some trusted guard. Or maybe hired a bunch of ninjas to hide it somewhere. Regardless, the one thing you didn't do was leave it anywhere near the lock. That would defeat the purpose of having a lock. The worst part was that he could see which key matched the door. Actually no, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that there were no traps on the keys or the door. That was inexcusable as far as he was concerned. As a ninja, his specialty was extracting things from places like this, but that still meant he had to know how to protect them first. The only reason he could think of to have the keys here was to trap either them or the door. And even then, he wouldn't have a key that could open the door. For that matter, he hadn't discovered the way yet, but he expected that magic could be used to lock doors without any sort of physical key. He shrugged. Someone was up to something. He didn't just rely on his eyes, despite the temptation. He tossed a kunai at the door and watched the effects. Most traps left traces if someone knew what to look for. The blunt end of the weapon struck the door. Nothing happened. He picked it up and tied a length of wire to the ring before flinging it up. The wire wrapped around the key that matched the door, and he dragged it down as it struggled. He prodded it with the tanto from his shoulder. Nothing. He opened the door. There was a chess set on the other side. He didn't think it would let him pass. So, he walked up the wall and along the ceiling. The stone figures began to toss their weapons up at him without any luck. Harry whistled to himself as he strolled to the far side and through the door there. So that's where Professor Stutterfaces put the other troll. He debated killing it, but didn't see the point. It was tempting, just to be sure, but he decided against it. Besides, the thing was too stupid to look up and see him, so it probably wasn't worth worrying about. The path to the next room, though, it gleamed to his eyes. The whole area was trapped to high heaven. And he hadn't the least idea what most of those effects did. Unlike secret passages, most rune work didn't have instructions written into them. Harry formed a pair of shadow clones and sent them ahead. The first one stepped into the hallway and paused. So far, so good, boss. It continued into the room at the far end. There are flames, boss. Thank you, number one, I can see them. Harry frowned. Is this what Professor Snape has to deal with? Nah. I don't know if there's an off button in here, boss. Everything looks like it's trapped, too. Harry sighed. There's a room on the far end of this one, boss. I can't see into it, though. So, his choices were to go back or poke around with his clones and find out what the traps did. He'd have to hope that none of them hit outside the trapped hallway of doom. He could try going outside the maze, but even then, there was no guarantee that he could get through that second wall of fire. Oh, and someone probably had the trap set to alert him, or her to their triggering, and would come to find out what was happening. He could use the cloak to hide from detection, but that would only get him to the neutral point of not caught. Unless he was really lucky and the person who set this up was incredibly stupid and decided to go check the other side of the traps while he followed. Yeah. That wasn't happening. Let some other idiot find out what they'd put at the end of the trap nest. That also explained why it was so easy to get around the other traps. Someone wanted people to reach this one. Of course, whoever designed this thing could have saved a lot of effort by having it at the beginning. Harry wasn't sure the point of lulling someone into the trap when they would walk into it anyway. Just put it at the bottom of the shaft and the person would be trapped anyway. It wasn't his problem, so he headed back the way he came. The troll was no more intelligent than it had been the other direction, and was ignored likewise. The poor chess set was still sorting out whose weapons were whose and were distracted. Harry was tempted to drop down and offer his assistance, but decided it might not be welcomed, given that there were stone fists being shaken at him. Instead, he gave them a cheeky wave, and used the key in his pocket to lock the door behind him. He let it free and it fluttered away to join its companions. If it had been able to make sounds, he felt certain it would have made a happy chirp. He ignored the giant dog that was now sitting in a puddle of its own urine, and left the corridor. It had been a tremendous disappointment. It hadn't been scary to start with, and then it turned out to be a letdown until the end. He wished he'd been able to see what was being kept in there, but there were levels of danger that he'd been taught to avoid, and anything where he would definitely get hit with unknown traps was pretty high on the list. Maybe something interesting would happen if he came back tomorrow night? "Hello, Professor," said Harry. Professor Stutterfaces gave a little shriek as he jumped a foot into the air. "What are you doing here at the corridor of not dangerous one bit?" Professor Stutterfaces whirled, clutching his chest with one hand and wheezing a little. He found Harry leaning against the wall, one leg over the other, hands in his pockets. Those stupid robes of his fell around him. There was the disconcerting aspect that he couldn't see the boy's eyes. His hair fell around his face like a shroud. "What are you doing here, Potter?" he snarled. "Sort of." It was a lot less snarl-y and much more gasping than he'd intended, but he added a pained glare to try and bring the fearsome level up a bit. "Leaning against the wall?" Stutterface's eye twitched. "Why are you here, then?" "I'm taking a stroll, Professor." The man's eyes narrowed. "At 2 in the morning? Best time for it, Professor." "No one bothers me." "And you don't think you could show me the same courtesy?" "I was wondering if you were planning to see what's at the end of the maze, that's all." "What?" "That's what's beyond the giant puppy," Harry replied. "No idea what's at the end, though." That was interesting. Professor Stutterface's body loosened slightly when Harry said that. His eyes showed him the muscles relaxing. "How would you know?" "Well, I poked my head down there, just to see, you know. But I didn't get to the end." Harry turned and began to walk down the hall. "By the way, Professor, I'm glad to see you're feeling better." "Thank you, Potter." "Did the unicorns help?" There was a sort of sound not unlike GRK from behind him. He saw the man's eyes bulge wide, and he clutched at his chest as his heart rate sped up. "And your recovery helped your stutter, too." Harry began to tap a random bit of wall. "I hope your other face is doing well." He stepped into the secret passage, leaving behind a further shriek as the professor opened his mouth. Then Harry lost sight of him and the passage's magic. That had been an exceptionally odd encounter, and he lived with his uncles. Oh well. The professor was probably going to be fine, what with one thing and another. It wasn't like the traps were that dangerous in the maze. Well, excepting the end of it, and anyone who stepped in there was stupid and deserved whatever happened to him. Or her, he had to admit, and Conan was just as dangerous as his uncles, but still. He spent an hour in the library, looking for a book on English grammar to see if there were a better way to phrase that thought. The next day, he skipped his classes to go through the library again, this time trying to find a translation charm. He had been meaning to read those books Hermione had gotten him for, well, since he'd seen them there wasn't much literature on the matter, and he got the impression that most wizards cared little for languages other than their own. The rare exceptions were intellectuals who'd simply learned the languages they had wanted to understand. More frustratingly, no one seemed interested in anything resembling contemporary languages. For some reason, they were all obsessed with Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. Come to think of it, why was nothing east of the Urals represented either? He would have expected plenty from India at the least. Judging from the history of this world, the land he was visiting had once held dominion over India for a time. Surely someone visited the place? Granted, he knew absolutely nothing about Indian writing, but since he knew what the books in the library did contain. Of course, given the nature of the library of Hogwarts, it was always possible he hadn't found the ones he was looking for. There were a couple of areas in the huge room that were hidden by walls. He noticed that pretty much everyone seemed unaware that the walls weren't normal ones. He could tell they had some sorts of conditions to bypass them, but he couldn't read them in the magical glow. What was worse was that the students who could enter the areas didn't seem to be aware of it. He'd considered asking what was in there, but there was a real chance that they couldn't answer. And given the security around those areas, he didn't want to find out the hard way by triggering some sort of failsafe. Magic was fun, but it left so many dangers. Strangely, Hermione was no help in his search. She hadn't come across anything about translation charms. She had expected he knew at least one of the languages the books she'd sent him were in. She'd taken a good bit of time to find them. She said she'd had to venture into Identic Alley to find a curio shop with books in those languages. No, she had no idea what was in them, but had decided to follow narrative convention, her phrasing, since that seems to be how the wizarding world works, and therefore went to a small store operated by a man of unclear but definitely Eastern origins and purchased any books he had in languages from what was classically the Far East. For all he knew, she'd bought him a pile of cookbooks. It didn't seem likely. The things radiated magic. He supposed there must be magical cookbooks, but the ones he'd seen in that Diagon place hadn't had anything resembling this sort of strength of aura. And while he didn't understand her short rant about story logic, or whatever it had been, he was clear that she was certain that the books were more than just random objects in a thrift shop. When he had time, he would need to take another field trip to get some books on languages. Chapter 12, Working on Bad Habits. Exams begin. All too soon, according to Hermione, everyone else seemed to think it was the opposite. Exams were rolling around. Most of Harry's friends were set to do at least moderately well, in no small part to Hermione's growing ability to actually explain instead of rant. The girl in question, of course, was certain she was doomed. Despite what everyone other than Harry told her, she was utterly convinced that she had missed some key thing she needed to study. Harry merely said that she had eidetic memory and should focus on her magic instead of things she already had in her head. That was her other problem. She was finding wandless magic slow going. It was her own desire to prove herself and the blinders she had on measuring against Harry that meant that she was utterly deaf to her peers' and teachers' continual exclamations of amazement as she was beginning to show mastery of the initial spells learned in their first year. Harry, on the other hand, was regularly walking out of class early since he'd finished the coursework for the day. Otherwise, he wrote his essays instead of paying attention much of the time. She was still annoyed that he essentially treated the rules not merely as suggestions, but as things that explicitly applied only to other people. The fact that the teachers had pretty much decided to go along with his interpretation somehow failed to assuage her. Instead of assuming they were right, it was making her a little crazy. Harry decided to help. Every time he found her studying, he dragged her along to explore somewhere. Usually, it was a place that was probably off limits to students or, at the very least, first years. Often, when he left a class, he took her with him, despite the fact that she was trying to pay attention to the lesson. For some reason, the teachers were either unaware of this happening, despite her rather audible complaints, or had just decided to permit it. Harry was hoping he was slowly breaking her of her belief in the rules as unassailable. Which brought them to the week leading up to exams. "Where are we going?" growled Hermione. She had been having a peaceful, relatively, dinner in the Great Hall when Harry had suddenly stood up, taken hold of her wrist, and proceeded to the exit. She'd been forced to run to keep up, and had lost her meal down Malfoy's back as her plate had been in her hand when she was yanked from her seat. She had no real objection to that part, at least despite her desire to obey the rules. Draco Malfoy was a poisonous little ferret. For some reason, she never thought of him as a weasel, who never failed to remind her of her inferior origins. Even Pansy had pretty much given up that since Hermione had been regularly demonstrating wandless magic with a command unseen outside of HarryPotter. No idea. Then stop. Oof. The last part came as he complied instantly, and she rammed into his back. It was rather like slamming into an old oak tree. He didn't even move as almost 100 pounds of accelerating 12-year-old impacted him. Hey, I know. He started running again. Her cry as he headed at a solid wall ended in a strangulated shriek as he went straight through the illusion and down the staircase behind it. How did you know about this? You mean you don't? It still regularly amazed Harry that so many people didn't know about these shortcuts. They played havoc with his eyes, mind, seeing a passage that went downward, but ended 3 floors above its start gave him headaches on a regular basis, and he was still trying to adjust his mental map to envision those twists of space-time. But the fact that everyone else was apparently ignorant of these useful paths boggled his mind. He ignored her scream of primal terror as he walked off a landing without a railing onto thin air and trotted along a solid stone corridor that was suddenly visible. People were so jumpy. It could frustrate an impatient individual. He'd found it best to simply ignore such problems. Here we are. Where is here? She asked warily. She expected that it would be one of those random sections of the castle that no one had been to for a century, and was probably unsafe. The 3rd floor. What? Is your hearing going? He asked, voice concerned. Should I take you to the medic for help with that? No. Oh good. Then I needn't repeat myself. Hello, Professor. The last part was to Professor Stutterfaces, who had just walked out the door. His screech was remarkably similar to Hermione's. Professor, began Hermione. I can explain. I kidnapped her, said Harry. She needs to try a bit of rule-breaking. Professor Stutterfaces just made sharp eep sounds as he held his chest, glaring at the two of them. I decided I would show her the not even a bit worrisome corridor because that might show why she doesn't need to be so concerned with rules. The glare intensified somehow and Stutterfaces had turned slightly purple with pale around the edges. I'm glad to see you're doing a little better, Professor, said Harry. I gather that visiting the medic was helpful? What are you talking about, Potter? Stutterfaces hissed. I know you visited her a week or so ago. No, longer. It was the day after I met up with you out here. What did you need something to help with heart failure for anyway? What? Hermione was utterly confused by this conversation. Professor Stutterfaces needed some potions from the medic labeled for their ability to help with heart problems. He looked at the purple professor. Are you well, sir? When he only got a strange throat sound, he nodded. Glad to hear it. He pushed past the stunned man and pulled Hermione through the door. Ow. He covered his ears, one with his hand and one with hers. Would you please stop screaming? Sound continued. What are you so upset about anyway? More continual sound. Are you scared? Sound. What of? The puppy over there? Harry shook his head. The sound was getting quieter. Are you breathing, at least? Still quieter. Okay, the sound is getting annoying. His finger stabbed a cluster of nerves on her neck that cut the scream suddenly. Much better. It struck him that he could probably have used magic to achieve the same goal, but he was pretty sure of his skill. There were fewer ways to stop his method of silence creation, even if a misapplication of the technique could render a victim permanently mute. Or an intentional application, in some cases. You know, he mused, you still don't seem to be breathing. The scream was now silent, but apparently ongoing. Yep. His finger jabbed several spots on her chest and abdomen. Chakra fired her nerve endings and her diaphragm dropped, forcing a tortuous breath into her lungs for the first time in nearly a minute. You going to manage from here out? He paused. Guess not. A series of different nerves caused the muscle to contract, and she exhaled. Still no good? Oh well. It took almost a minute of him manually operating her lungs before she took a shuddering breath of her own. Her mouth moved for quite a few seconds before he blinked. I should probably fix that. His finger prodded the cluster he'd hit first, and her voice suddenly cut in. Horrible, horrible person. You deserve to owe. What did you do? Made sure you didn't pass out and die. Specifics, please. Operated your diaphragm for you. You seem to be having trouble with it. Why was that, anyway? She pointed behind him, and her eyes went wider than they had been. If you start screaming again, I'm going to have to make you quiet again. No? Good. He walked over to the cowering Cerberus, her feet making scratching noises as Harry dragged her along the stone floor. He's not dangerous. He's a puppy who wishes he were with his mum, aren't you? He broke off, boy. The giant dog whimpered pitifully and tried to back through the wall it was pressed up against. See? He's not mean. He tried to use her hand to pet the dog, but despite the confined space, it put up a remarkable display of dodging to avoid possibly coming into contact with him. Oh well. He frowned. I guess I could show you the stuff down below, but that was much less interesting. He shrugged and began to leave, finding that she was still not helping move and simply pulling her with him. When the door shut behind them, she smacked him. Well, she tried to. Her hand swept through the space that his head had occupied shortly before. You jerk. What? He avoided the follow-up strike with ease as well. That was a Cerberus. They're dangerous. Nah. Harry waved his free hand dismissively. That was a pup at best. It had barely reached the knee of Uncle Payne's familiar. Hardly a threat. What? Are you going to do that thing where you just keep asking for explanations? Am I what? I guess you are. You probably want to get to the last Transfiguration class of the year, right? What? What? I'm going to assume that's a no then. Harry smiled and headed into another passageway that had been masquerading as a window onto the grounds. Good. I'll show you this place in the astronomy tower that has a view through the giant telescope, and no one seems to know about it. And he trotted off, ignoring the stream of what s emitted by his companion at irregular intervals. The exams came in their due time, to the relief of Hermione, who had supplanted her fear of failure with a fear of being dragged off yet again. She had decided that no matter how unprepared she was, it could not be worse than another expedition into some untraveled part of the castle where she would be dangled over some horrible walkway while alligators, where had they gotten alligators for Scotland's climate, tried to nibble at her toes, her shoes long ago dropped into some swampy pit. Really, she was convinced more than ever that adventure was best experienced on this side of a nice, normal page covered in ink. Their first exam was for Transfiguration. Hermione fretted the entire time during the written portion, despite citing sources perfectly. The rest of the little clique had been studying with the increasingly harassed Hermione, and had therefore memorized a good bit of the material for the test. McGonagall didn't even comment when Harry handed in an exam 5 minutes after the start, ink already dry. Teachers did a reasonable job of locking their doors and windows against magical intrusion, but ninja were supposed to enter places that were explicitly forbidden. If one didn't enter the Emperor's private chambers, how was one to kill him in his sleep, after all? And so he had decided that he would find out what the exams were beforehand. It was only sporting, since they hadn't kept him out. Of course, he didn't want to spoil Hermione's fun lecturing the others, so he let her continue instead of sharing. In addition to his completed essay, and perfect multiple choice and short answer sections as well, he proceeded to turn the tortoise into an excessively elaborate tea kettle, and then into a turtle with the explanation, "Back and forth is too easy." Since the turtle had a shell with ornate detailing not found on the kettle, McGonagall had a sort of misty look on her face and completely missed that Harry had then trotted out of the room, giving Hermione a jaunty wave. History of magic was even less noteworthy. Harry had learned by judicious application of intelligence gathering, spying, that Bins always gave the same exams. Moreover, he found out that Bins always assigned the same grades to the same seats in the class. Apparently, he was in a bit of a rut. So Harry decided he wouldn't trouble the disturbed ghost and just didn't show up. Over dinner, they were treated to a running commentary by Hermione, who bemoaned the fact that her teapot had been tortoiseshell patterned despite several attempts by Blaise to point out that the pattern in question had been different than her original tortoise. "Just stop trying, Blaise," grumbled Pansy. "She'll just find something else to worry about." Astronomy was intensely frustrating for the entire rest of his year group. For some reason, Harry seemed to have incredibly good eyesight, since he would peer through the same telescope they did, and then pronounce the answer with a degree of precision that the professor herself was unable to match through their equipment. He had decided not to bother people by telling them that his Byakugan could see the eyepiece of the new telescope in a different area of the tower, and so he was using the massively more powerful device for his work. It was probably for the best, he decided. That didn't stop the professor from gushing constantly about his prodigious skill in the utterly useless field of staring at balls of rapidly decaying hydrogen. Especially hydrogen that had long since already been transformed into other elements. He couldn't see the use. A few potions apparently cared about the observable light from a long-dead star, so he supposed there might be an application, but it struck him as silly. Instead, he concerned himself with the moon and planets, which would at least be there when they were seen, and would also conceivably, therefore, have an effect on something even if no one seemed able to explain why a planet's position in its orbit relative to that of the Earth would make a difference. Harry decided to save his professor a good deal of headache 2 days later, when their exams resumed. Specifically, he failed categorically to even show up for potions. From what he was informed by his classmates, Professor Snape was torn between being utterly livid and gleeful that he would be able to give Harry a T. Harry was still having some trouble with the grading system, since it seemed to be entirely based on arbitrary titles instead of any sort of actual order. Hermione reported at dinner that Draco Malfoy had attempted to sabotage her potion. Actually, she reported that he had been planning on it. Since Pansy had heard about it through the grapevine, she had told Daphne and Blaise. Blaise, in turn, decided not to trouble Professor Snape about the matter. He did, however, inform Harry. Harry had, therefore, spent the early morning hours going through Draco Malfoy's possessions and coating his clothing with some compounds that would react poorly to the fumes produced during the early stages of the brewing process in the potion the exam was to be on, something that he probably wasn't supposed to know. But what else was expected of him when Snape locked the exam notes in a drawer in a safe in his private quarters under an illusion? Harry was suitably shocked, grinning knowingly, when he learned that Draco Malfoy's potion had detonated catastrophically during the first few minutes of the exam. Apparently, someone had modified his cauldron to focus the spray only upwards, limiting the damage that Malfoy's failures usually caused. Instead, Malfoy alone was rushed to hospital, the flesh on his front scorched and blackened. To the luck of the castle, his lungs had been too badly damaged by the heat to scream loudly, and he was now under a silencing charm, while the medic worked on healing him. "Gosh," said Harry, one hand at his mouth. However, could he have introduced pixie blubber to the potion? Not even bothering to wait to find out what potion they were supposed to have been making to exclaim in surprise. Snape stalked over about that moment. "Potter," he paused. "I will see you expelled for this." His tone wasn't particularly vehement. "And detention for the rest of the year." "For what, Professor?" "Trying to kill Malfoy." "Again." "But I wasn't even there, Professor." "I'm not sure why I should take that into account. It's not like you're going to show up anyway." True. Did you have anything to do with it?" hissed Hermione after Snape left. "No." "Oh good." She paused. "Are you lying to me again?" "No." She frowned. "And if I asked if that were a lie?" "I would lie." Hermione was trying to ignore how the rest of the group was snickering. Except Blaise. He was laughing so hard he'd fallen off the bench. and rolled under the table. "Glad you agree," replied Harry cheerfully. He got up and patted her cheek. "No need to thank me. I didn't do anything, after all." "What?" "Good night, Hermione." Harry left the great hall, whistling softly to himself. Chapter 13, Grades Above the Grade. Over breakfast the next day, they were regaled by Hermione with the random minutiae of charms that she thought might be important. Every now and again, Harry would interject a point or two, usually about how something might not be on the exams, or that it might be slightly different. It was invariably met with a sniff and a, "but we covered it in class," or "that's not how it was done in class." Harry decided to continue with his usual policy of letting her talk everyone else's ears off and stop trying to help by cutting her off on things not part of the exam. He felt it was an indictment of the magical world that it was so innocent or clueless about normality, non-magicality. He wasn't sure what the proper term was, that they just outright ignored solutions that didn't use magic. In this case, though, that wasn't really applicable. Of course, it said all sorts of things about their awareness of the world around them that despite all the charms on Professor Tiny's office, he had utterly failed to defend against access through the door in his ceiling behind the permanent illusion of stone. Really, it was only a 30-foot drop to the floor, hardly something to be overlooked. Since someone had effectively left the door open for him, not that closing and locking the door counted. Ninja, he felt it was only polite to go find out what was going to be tested. It was highly informative. There were some other, personal effects in the office that Harry made sure to note for later. If he ever needed something from Professor Tiny, there were all sorts of things to use. Uncle Sasori always complained when Harry didn't need to master the art of putting everything back in place to search a room. He learned it anyway, of course, because his dad said he should. "Full marks, Mr. Potter," declared Professor Flitwick. "But we haven't even started," protested Hermione. "So? He isn't here." She was nearly wailing. "I'm not sure how that makes a difference, Miss Granger." He smiled at her. "Unless you dispute that he would manage to earn full marks." She trailed off into grumbles and was in a black mood for the rest of the period. Doubly so because she was successfully doing the classwork for the exam without a wand, and that was just going to make him more convinced that he was right. As far as she was concerned, that was the last thing the school needed. "Good work, Miss Granger," enthused the tiny half-goblin. "I see Mr. Potter has been teaching you." Her muttered words were the closest she'd come to cursing in hours. Being around Harry somehow caused her to wish that she weren't a well-behaved young woman. More to the point, she wished she felt more at home swearing, because she believed that she would somehow feel better if she could properly vent her frustration. "How?" she snarled in Harry's face as he tried to eat his lunch. "Could you clarify a little?" "To be fair," added Tracy, "the rest of us are just as lost as Harry here. How does he manage to get a professor to give him full marks for cutting the exam? Talent? I wish I had mastered banishing already," she spat venomously. "Why?" She picked up a roll and threw it at him. He ducked, earning a squawk of outrage from Crabbe when it struck him in the head. It was followed by a sound of joy as he realized there was more food on his plate, and he proceeded to dig in with every sign of enjoyment and that he had forgotten the ballistic victuals. "Oh." Harry shrugged. "You could have just told me instead of demonstrating by hitting a peer with food." His subsequent dodge of a chicken leg without looking in her direction would probably have resulted in massive points loss and a food fight, but Goyle was so happy to see extra meat that he didn't care about the grease smearing his hair, and the house was still at 0 points, so there wasn't anything that could be done. Snape couldn't even give Harry detention as Harry was already committed to ignoring them through the end of the year. Dumbledore rose and watched the assembled crowd. When they failed to stop their conversations, arguments, eating, petting, and so on, he raised his wand and conjured a flock of birds. Then he hit them with a booming detonation charm. The screeches and the explosion brought silence as shreds of white feathers fell on the assembled students. "Thank you for your attention." There are some important announcements regarding the exams which are, as of yet, ongoing through the end of the week. In this case, I must report several things about the defense exams. The first is to those students who have already taken it. I am sorry, I must inform you that your grade is invalidated. Those of you who took your OWLs and NEWTs have nothing to worry about, as your marks remain in effect. That includes the two of you over there in Ravenclaw whose grades I am ashamed to admit are involved with Hogwarts. I'm talking to Miss Grey and Mr. Famney. Both you would have been better served studying for your exams, and less how the other looks without clothing. Those of you who are slated to still take your defense exam, you will not be taking it this year. There had been some issues which came up. The first is that Professor Stutterfaces has fled the castle, pursued by the Aurors. Since this is the first time such a thing has happened, shocking as that might be to some of you, it qualifies as an exceptionally rare circumstance under the Hogwarts Charter, and is therefore grounds for the cancellation of an exam. Miss Granger, I feel certain you will survive the lack of validation by an incompetent in one of your classes. That brings me to the third item. I was called away to the ministry this morning because Cornelius Fudge is a moron. He wanted help with something or other. I think it was making sure that his new policy about the wallpaper for the ministry was a good one. As it turns out, he didn't really need to see me. When I find out who attempted to prank me by making me think that the minister is even stupider than he is, I will show my displeasure. While I was at the ministry, I decided to check up on our now absent professor's qualifications. I was shocked to learn that the former Muggle Studies professor lacked any formal qualification for teaching one of the central classes at this institution of magical learning. When the Aurors arrived to investigate, they were ambushed and are in mighty pursuit of the perpetrator who managed to clamber out the window while they were blinded. I have it on good authority that they will capture our errant professor any moment now. One last announcement, those of you planning to celebrate the end of exams, please make sure you are protected. If someone goes home pregnant, being expelled will be the least of the worries of the unhappy parents involved. He pointed to the bits of bird that lay on people's plates. Good night. The remainder of the week before the end of the year was spent normally by nearly the whole castle. Several denizens of Hogwarts expressed their displeasure at the fact that Harry Potter had apparently decided to take a vacation early and simply failed to present himself at meals for several days. During that time, he was totally absent as far as anyone could tell, since no one found him. Given that he seemed to have a more complete idea of where things were in the castle than anyone, that might not be proof, of course. Harry turned up for breakfast the day they were being dismissed for summer vacation, engrossed in a book about Hangul. He was making notes in a decidedly not magical composition book using a disposable pen and eating by levitating the food to his mouth, so he could focus on the pages. Every now and then, he would mutter something about cross-referencing something, then make some more notes. "Where have you been?" asked Hermione, demanded might be a fairer description. Harry's response was completely lost on them. "Oh, sorry. I've been a bit busy reading up on languages." "Where?" "London." "What? We're doing that again?" "What thing?" Harry didn't respond to her for 20 minutes. He sometimes made conversation with the rest of the group at random intervals. His joining of the interaction had no rhyme or reason, and it didn't help that he was speaking in a mix of something like a dozen languages that no one at the table spoke. Dumbledore flung a burning hex into the bacon on the head table, causing food to launch into the air and rain festive bits of scorched pork product on everyone. So, it is time to end a year of studying and learning new things. I realize most of you did so with members of the opposite gender instead. He gave a half-glare around the hall. I have no doubt that most of you are eager to leave this institution of intellectual pursuits, so that you may sooner empty your heads of all thought and focus on things more important to the short-sighted minds of the very young and innocently stupid. Book lists will be sent out over the summer for your classes next year. Those of you taking electives need to inform Professor McGonagall prior to your exit from the castle today. Some of you will no doubt take that as only a suggestion. If you fail to select your classes before leaving, you will not have electives next year, your teachers will assign you extra work as a result, and if you decide to join electives the following year, you will be joining a class of students younger than you. Make of that what you will." He paused and twinkled at everyone. "The house elves have packed your things and loaded them onto the express. As such, you are all free to go. A word of warning, after several incidents in which students were left behind by the train, we are instituting a new policy. Namely, alerting you to the fact that the train leaves promptly in 1 hour, at which time it will be your problem to return home." Several students rose and were nearly at the door when Dumbledore spoke again. "I probably should award the house cup, but if you people missed the red and gold papering the walls, then I see no reason to bother your overtaxed brains now. But with that in mind, I need to make a few announcements. Please return to your seats. Thank you. The announcement I truly wish to make is to laud HarryPotter as the first student to ever receive, across the board, straight O+. He began to clap and found that no one was joining in. He looked over at the other faculty. "Is there something wrong?" "I didn't give him an O+, said Flitwick. "Nor I," added Sprout. "I failed him for not even taking the exam," growled Snape. "All the more impressive feat, then." Dumbledore twinkled some more. "Albus," snapped McGonagall, "there is no such grade as O+. Which only makes it a far greater achievement than I had hitherto believed." He turned back to the students. "And so, with the knowledge that someone has better grades than all of you, you are dismissed. You have just over 55 minutes to be on board the train. Good day." Harry ducked another thrown item of food as Hermione began to rant. He tuned most of it out, since it seemed to be repeating itself and generally was a made-up variance of how, which he got tired of quickly. Draco Malfoy was reduced to a whimpering wreck as his raw skin and recently grafted cauldron-grown flesh was pelted with a steady stream of foodstuffs, while his ears, just healed from their damage in the conflagration, were subjected to a sonic barrage. Up at the high table, Snape sighed and shook his head, already anticipating yet another angry letter from Lucius Malfoy. The man was mostly annoyed at the cost of repairing the family scion, since Hogwarts was a learning experience, and part of that was learning how not to shoot oneself in the foot. But regrowing 30% of his son's flesh, a pair of lungs, and almost all his skin was well outside what Hogwarts was willing to subsidize when the parent of the idiot in question could afford to buy the treatments. It was part of how the school managed to pay for medical treatment of those less fortunate, when a student with a rich family was badly injured, which was practically a guarantee at Hogwarts. Not only was treatment not given away, but there was a substantial charge attached to the cost as well. Since Hogwarts policy said that a student couldn't be removed from the school, unless the Medowitch on premises was actually unable to cure the condition, and even then, the list of clauses countering that option essentially forbade it, parents were forced to part with hefty piles of gold to have minor ailments cured. Worse conditions could do a great deal of damage to a financially independent family. Those with multiple idiot spawn had been known to be rendered impoverished over the course of a year, spent in one fell swoop before their lesson funds could absolve them of their payments. The bill could, on occasion, grow to such a size that there was no way to pay it off, at which point the debtors were required to render their families unto Hogwarts, the family becoming indentured servants in perpetuity. At the moment, there was but a single relic of this policy, one Argus Filch. The elderly caretaker was the last in a line that had spent several generations in servitude to Hogwarts after an especially large bill. Despite his grouchy behavior, he was actually quite glad of his position in life. That is to say that if he had been born outside of the condition of being bound to Hogwarts, his family would have drowned him for his lack of functional magic. Instead, he got to live in a huge castle, room, board, his cat, and to threaten little children with whatever horrible punishments he thought would be funny to see them go all wide-eyed about. The hardest part of his job was keeping track of just what the little devils were using to make trouble, because he was in charge of keeping the list of forbidden items, and had been told that everything was not a valid list. Filch's was the last family to attempt an evasion of a bill to Hogwarts. The headmaster of the castle was generally a very canny old witch or wizard with a healthy dose of cunning and a certain mercenary streak. Also, they could, to a one, hold a grudge. In the case of the most recent attempt, the family had disowned their idiot son. The school, of course, paid his medical bills, which were excessive. When the family reowned him following his graduation, the headmaster of the time had shown up within minutes at Gringotts with a roll of parchment. Since the scion of the house has been returned to the family, they now must pay his outstanding bills, had said the man. He smiled. And I feel compelled to mention that there is an additional trying to fuck with me fee that beggars belief. I highly doubt anyone has sufficient funds to pay it alone. Oh, and there's compound interest. Let us say 17% per day. That sounds about right. Now get those sons of bitches down here to sign some slave contracts before I get annoyed in this nice, stable bank. You heard Professor McGonagall. Hermione was grousing as Harry looked up from the book he had been pretending to read. He'd been reading the one in his bag. There is no such grade as O+, so how did Harry get them? Talent? He interjected. Blaise had an arm around Hermione's shoulder, and was trying valiantly to calm her down, but she had a full head of steam going. And you didn't even show up to several exams. How did you not fail them? Even more talent? Truly, I am simply more skilled than you. He lay back and the large copy of Hogwarts, a history slammed into the wall of the compartment, then sat up quickly, and it fell onto the seat behind him. To be fair, said Daphne. Are you really all that surprised? I mean really? No. And that makes it worse. There's just no pleasing you, is there? Snapped Pansy. What? Oh, you're doing that again, said Harry. I mean that you're not happy that Harry did something you expected of him, or at least don't find shocking. You've been in closer proximity to him than anyone for the better part of 8 months and you're still getting upset. Pansy shrugged. I think the rest of us just decided not to worry ourselves if the universe is collapsing around us. Speaking of which, said Harry. Do you want to borrow my books over the summer? What? I'm going to pretend that's a yes. Harry lay back and dozed lightly until they pulled into King's Cross. See you guys in a couple months. I have to go home and see if my uncle managed to kill my uncle or not. He waved. Bye now. He slipped out of King's Cross and headed for Diagon Alley, where he met up with a glowering Severus Snape. Why couldn't I give you your portkey at the castle instead of waiting here for you? No idea, Professor. I guess I'm supposed to get something out of riding the train? HN. Hey. You sound like my dad. What? Bye, Professor. Harry vanished. Chapter 14, It's Spoon's Fault. Hey Dad, guess what I owe gods? Harry threw himself down as his father's eyes went from sleep to kaleidoscopic Sharingan, and a blob of dark fire shot in his general direction. Dad. It's me. Harry pulled the invisibility cloak from his head. What? I'm home. How did you sneak up on me? This magic cloak I got at school. It makes me invisible. That shouldn't be enough to keep me from sensing you in my sleep. Harry shrugged. Why didn't you tell me you owned something this awesome? What? The note not from the headmaster said he got it from my father. Harry. Itachi sighed. You do recall that you're adopted, right? Yes. So, you have a biological father out there somewhere? Yes. And people might be talking about him when they reference your father. Especially if they knew him. Oh wow, that makes more sense. Harry grinned. I wondered how Professor Snape could hate you so much when you'd never been to England. I'm not asking. Harry trotted out of his father's room. Hey everyone. I have gifts. Itachi sighed again and rubbed his eyes. They hurt and his eyesight was getting worse, but he'd reacted badly to the shock of someone suddenly talking next to him. He still had a few years left before he'd need to face Sasuke. Hi, Uncle Kisame. Hey brat. Kisame reached out and cuffed the kid upside the head. Someone else would have been decapitated instead of nearly stumbling a bit. How was, he snickered. School? Actually, it was pretty fun. Hari grinned as he casually dodged a swing from Samahata. As he expected, his kick to his uncle's face didn't even annoy the giant man. I met someone bigger than you, for one thing. He made a wee sound as Kisame flicked him off his sword. And there were lots and lots of secret passages to learn. If I ever need to kill someone important there, no one will find me. Already planning for graduation, then? Yep. But I don't think they graduate like that. Shame. Yeah. But I made friends. Or found people who kind of like me and spend time with me. Close enough. Samahata took a chunk out of the floor as hair landed on the sword again. What magic did you learn? Not a lot, I admit. I think they wanted to make sure we understood what we're doing first. Pussies. But I did a bit of self-study. It's sad just how little they taught, considering the number of Wais. Hair landed feet first on the wall. They have to kill people. Really unenlightened, that bunch. I can't do most of it yet, but I'm working on that. Good. Now what was it you said about gifts? Oh. Right. Hari abruptly turned and exited the room, dodging Kisame's swing as he did. Hey, Uncle Pain. Hari. Pain turned from his giant map. Over time, it had gotten significantly more detailed as Sasori's web of informants spread ever wider. There were currently more than a dozen figurines in various places. Sitting in the middle of Fire Country was a white robe with a red hat. In case anyone missed what the figure was for, it said fire on the hat. Similar figures were in the other 4 of the largest lands. A cat and an octopus bull in lightning, a monkey in a thing in stone, a slug and a turtle in mist, a fox in leaf, and a beetle in waterfall. There was another slug and a pig on a town in fire. Leaf was crowded. There was a raccoon sitting inside its drawn walls, as were a pale snake and a figure with warts standing on an inky pool. Crowded into there were also an iron hand formed into a fist, a sleeping dog with one red eye open, a slouching monkey with a fan clutched in one hand and a loincloth that said fire, and a bed made of obsidian. There was also an upside-down tree with little figures with white faces balanced on it. There was a decrepit female vomiting a red tide with bits of black-dyed cotton dribbling from her mouth nestled deep in water with a white sphere alongside her. In cloud was a female figure made of pumice. In sand was a little white marionette, weathered with age, and a woman with a pile of dust at her feet and a ball of fire in her hand. I got everyone gifts. You what? I was traveling and got people things. Could you call them? Pain sighed and turned away from his map. I have a feeling I will regret this. His hand rose and a gong on the far side of the room slammed itself against the knocker behind it. 10 minutes later, the Akatsuki had gathered. Hari beamed at everyone. Then he was slammed to the ground as an orange-masked figure tackled him. Toby missed Hari, shouted the man. Without Hari, Toby got blamed for everything. If it makes you feel better, replied Hari from under his most exuberant uncle. I got blamed for everything that happened at my school. He paused. To be fair, they were pretty much right, but still. Itachi picked up Toby by the collar and set him at the large meeting table where the others had already sat. Please refrain from that until after the rest of us are free to return to our own tasks. Toby pouted as best he could behind his mask. Toby was just happy, he muttered. Hari slid his thumb on his teeth and popped one of the storage seals on his forearm. 10 boxes wrapped in gaudy paper sprang into existence, and he picked one up. Here, Uncle Toby, he held out a small, flat package. For you. Toby tore open the gift and examined the pink circle within. Toby doesn't understand. It's got instructions on the back. Toby turned it over. After a few moments, Toby fell out of his chair, laughing. I don't want to know, said Pain. I really don't want to know. Uncle Haydn. Harry held out his offering. Haydn opened it and grinned at the book, 1,000 Obscure Curses, or How to Make Everything Dirty. Uncle Kakuzu. The oldest member of the Akatsuki opened his heavy, lumpy package, and found it was a leather sack filled with gold coins. I still owe you a beating for messing up one of my hearts. Uncle Zetsu. The black half of the duo looked on in disdain as his white side gleefully opened his gift. From inside, a green vine lashed out and began to try to strangle him. The plantman cheerily worked at keeping it from finishing the job. Devil's snare, added Harry. They have great stuff lying around my school. The gathered ninja nodded. That made sense. Uncle Sasori. The gift was opened with the caution of the unterminally paranoid. Inside was a jar. It's magical wood varnish, explained Harry. It keeps away bugs, strengthens the material, and so on. He got a nod from the hulking figure. Uncle Daidara. Daidara's caution was more born of having tongues and not wanting paper cuts. Inside was a cube of gray material. Clay? Nope. Harry's grin was predatory. It's called Composition 4. Remind me to show you how it works after this. Uncle Kisame. Kisame eyed the package with concern. It had holes in it. When it was opened, from inside came a faint mew. Harry? Yes? Is that a cat? No. 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 Kisame gently lifted out what looked rather like a ball of auburn fluff with big, green eyes and a pink ribbon around its neck. Tied into a bow. It mewed again. Because it sure looks like a cat. It's not. Kisame sighed. I see you're learning from your father. If it's not a cat, what is it? A Kneazle. A what? It's a magical creature. They often form attachments with people and live with them. They purr when content and mostly treat humanity with a dismissive attitude. So a cat. No. It's a cat. It's not a cat. It is. Isn't. Is. Isn't. Is you know something? We're not doing this. The kitten mewed again and batted at his sleeve. Would you quit that? Kisame poked it. It licked his finger. I hate you, Harry. I love you too, Uncle Kisame. He turned to Pain. Uncle Pain. One of the other paths stepped forward and poked the box a few times. When nothing happened, the path used a chakra rod to open it. What? The Naraka path lifted out 7 identical pendants, each on a string of bright pink beads. Well, they have these things called friendship lockets or something, said Harry. They split in 2 and each person wears one so they can put them together and show they're still friends or something. But I figured you needed more pieces, so I had them make the set. Pink beads? Only kind they had, Harry lied virtuously. Right. Glad you agree. Harry jumped in time to avoid the laser blast from the Azura path, landing in front of his father. Dad. Itachi formed a clone, which drew a kunai and carefully teased the wrapping open. HN. He lifted out a white t-shirt with the legend, "My son went to another world, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." Harry snickered as he went to his lone aunt. Did you know that I didn't meet a single person with your hair color in England? Come again? I was just thinking about it, and I realized that no one had anything like your hair color. Harry shrugged and held out a present. Aunt Conan. She produced a paper blade from a finger and delicately opened the box. She glanced inside and her eyes grew huge. Then her face turned bright red and Harry's Byakugan picked up actual heat waves. I got you books for your collection. The very moving. Conan's voice sounded very faint. Yeah. Wizard pictures do that. Her eyes bugged out still more as she watched something in one of the books. What is? Hippogriff. Hari's response did not seem to help. What did Hari get you? Asked Pain, leaning over. Then the Deva path was flying out the now-open window. Oh, okay then, said Kisame, ignoring the kitten licking his hand. I'm going to file that under the list of things not to ask about then. Conan's expression was icy, aside from being bright red still. You do that. Hari suddenly grinned. Uncle Haydn? What brat? I want to show you something. And? So I need you to go about a click that way. Hari pointed out the broken window. What? No. Hari's voice was firm. I'm not dealing with that shit. Now leave. Wahidon's cry was suddenly cut off as Hari grabbed his face and threw him out the window. When you pick yourself up, go where I told you to, Hari called down. He turned back to the others. Let me show you what I got for myself. Why did Haydn just land next to me? Asked Pain as he walked into the room. He was being difficult. The orange-haired punk rocker lookalike gathered with the other Akatsuki. What are we watching? My new toy. Hari swiped a bloodied thumb over his right wrist and caught the Barrett M95 that appeared from the cloud of smoke. Watch this. He casually swung the weapon up at his hip. What are you going to do with that? Asked Kisame. There's no way that has the range to the sudden bang cut him off. Holy. Pain's eyes were wide. Kakuzu? Yes. I need you to go put Haydn back together. Come again? He's missing most of his torso. And he's concerned about the separation of his shoulders from the mass of him that has knees. Kakuzu shrugged and walked down the side of the tower in the ever-present drizzle. That is such bullshit. Growled Kisame as the kitten nibbled his palm. Would you stop that? He has a point, Hari, murmured Conan as she walked over to the broken window, letting the cool air help reduce her scorching blush. It's rather unfair. I don't plan to use it unless I can't do things the normal way, replied Hari. It's really unsporting. He paused. Besides, if I used it all the time, people would be ready for it. And I can't give these out. I mean, if everyone had one, how would anyone be able to go above ground? As it is, if I manage to work out how to electroplate them with chakra-reactive metal, I'll use lightning to punch through defenses. The Akatsuki, sans Zetsu, blanched when they considered the concept of such a weapon in the hands of a boy with the Byakugan. Hari had been lucky enough that his eyes were able to see a little shy of 2 kilometers. If he could reliably hit targets with this monster at those ranges. Unsporting, agreed Pain shakily. Yes. It struck him just how bad it would be if, say, Leaf had access to this. He would be unable to stop Hyuga from just blowing his head off. Itachi nodded silently. He was glad his son had demonstrated his awareness of reality to the point that he'd worked out how bad it would be to hand that thing out to everyone. Yeah. They have better ones that I'll grab next time, but I wanted to practice with this a bit first. Hari missed the fleeting terror on his family's faces as he trotted from the room. Hari, Pain said. Yes? Hari had been sitting on the ceiling of Pain's map room, fiddling with his new gun. He didn't have much working knowledge of runes yet, but he was able to manage passable seals, and had been working on the idea of adding a storage seal to the Barrett's magazine. It was a bolt action, so he was fairly limited on his rate of fire already, and he didn't want to slow it further by having to reload after every engagement. Can I have a word with you? Yes. Hari didn't look up down. He was never sure about that, from what he was doing. I meant that you should come down here. Pain sighed. 10 months had apparently been enough for him to forget his nephew's tendency to take things literally. Oh. Yes. And when I asked, it was an order. Oh. Hari released the chakra from his thighs and landed right side up in front of his uncle. What's up? Your gift for Deidara, prompted Pain. What about it? How do I put this nicely? You can't get him any more of it. Why? You're really asking me that? Yes. Well, if you really must know. Pain closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and glared at the boy. It's because he destroyed half of the shopping district in rain, wrecked the drainage for most of the village, caused a flood in the lowland farms, raised a small town in which his target was a single bandit, not, in fact, a school, blasted apart an orphanage in Earth, although I grant he has his reasons for that. I really want someone to work with him on his issues there, and just a small incident here blew up several floors of my tower. He does that without C4, replied Harry. Not in one day. Snapped Pain. I'm trying to run a respectable organization for missing Nin. It's hard enough to do that given Hayden unable to handle capture missions and Kisame's lax attitude towards civilian casualties without my explosives expert having little accidents because he's not used to the magnitude of the explosives he's working with. You seem a little upset, Uncle Payne. Just a bit. As it is, I'm just glad Deidara didn't make any bigger mistakes. Do you know how hard it is to find someone with his potential? What would I have done if he'd blown his hand off when nibbling on your gift? Asked me to find you a magic specialist who can regenerate it? I'd have been out of what? There are medics, expensive medics of course, who can regenerate whole limbs off of a person's own genetic template. Oh. Payne frowned. It would have still been annoying. And he might have managed to kill himself. Can they fix that? No idea. If they can, they don't talk about it much. There are a lot of books at school, and I can only read so many at once. You have the Byakugan. And? Can't you read them all? Setting aside the difficulty in processing thousands of books at a time, there are plenty of them, I simply can't read with these. Hari tapped the side of his face. And that's not to mention the fact that I'm pretty careful to avoid doing that, in case there are books with nasty effects on the reader. Oh. Yeah. Did you know that there are books that can melt the reader's eyes? And while most of them are labeled most, mind you, if I read the warning at the same time as the book, I'm out of luck, aren't I? Well. So, it's completely possible there's a way to bring them back. I have no idea though. I see. Nevertheless, you are not allowed to get Deidara more explosives. I don't need those kinds of complaints again. Alright, fine. Can I get him ANFO then? I guess. Cool. Chapter 15, Visits. Hari, said Itachi. His son continued to read a book he'd brought home. It would do no good to order him to look at him. His son would only point out that he was looking at him. We're taking a trip. That didn't get much of a reaction, and Itachi wondered if this was what having a teenager was going to be like. To Leaf. There was a burst of wind as his son was suddenly no longer in the chair. The clattering from the next room suggested that he was grabbing weapons. I'm glad I have your attention. Itachi walked over to see that Hari was testing various kunai for sharpness. Because I want to give you some instructions. Yeah? Hari was sealing shuriken into his forearms. There is a man in Leaf. He's exceptionally dangerous. Hatake Kakashi? No. Mato guy? No. The Hokage? He's dead, and no. What? He's dead. Now would you stop interrupting? Hari's head bobbed. Thank you. His name is Shimura Danzo. Another nod. He has a force of false ANBU he calls Root. Nod. He's very dangerous. Nod. So, I want you to be careful to avoid him and his ANBU. Nod. I'm fond of you. Nod. So I like you not dead. Nod. You're clear, you're not to go near Shimura Danzo, right? Nod. Good. I'm glad we had this talk. Dad. Itachi sighed as he ducked under Guy's fist. Look what I found. One moment, Itachi jumped back from one of Guy's strikes. What did you, dear gods, what is that? No idea. I got it from Danzo's shoulder. You got it from. Itachi's eyes spun wildly and shot a wall of fire in front of Guy, stymieing his movements for a moment. I told you to stay away from Danzo. Yeah. Well. I thought I'd see what was so interesting. You are most unyouthful to not pay attention to dear gods, what is that? Guy's movements stalled as he caught sight of Hari. Danzo's arm, apparently. Kisame looked up from where he was avoiding Kakashi's attempts to kill him. What is my idiot nephew holding? The traitor thinks it's Danzo's arm, replied the copy ninja as he charged a 1,000 birds, only to dispel it when the shark's skin got in the way. Are those Sharingan in it? Itachi's voice was a bit higher pitched than normal as he swung a kunai down, blocking the attempt to ram a lightning cutter into his spine. Apparently Kakashi had decided to swap with Guy. Yep. Hari kicked Kurenai in the back of the knee and bashed her head with the blunt side of a kunai. He figured that if his father wasn't killing people, then maybe this was one of those non-lethal missions. He hated those. He drove the blade into her thigh, just scratching a major artery on the grounds that it would keep her from returning to combat if she woke. 10 of them. Well, it's been fun, copy ninja. Itachi's eyes spun and Kakashi dropped. But I have places to be. Black fire lashed at Guy, sending him jumping back as Itachi and Kisame turned and left the village. Guy looked around before deciding to get Kurenai to medical attention first. He nearly dropped the shapely jonin as he stood stock still. Did he say dad? Youth. Hari, said Itachi. Yes, dad. What did I say about Danzo? That he was really, really dangerous? Indeed. Anything else? That I shouldn't go near him? Very good. What did you do? Got near him? Right again. Why? I wanted to see what made him so dangerous. The last time someone told me that something was certain death, all it had was a 3-headed puppy, some weird vines, a bunch of flying keys, a chess set, a troll, and a corridor too trapped for me to bother testing. Of course. Hari watched as his father closed his eyes, wiping at the dribbles of blood running down the sides of his face. I got something else while I was there. I should have known. Can I have it, Dad? Sure. Itachi opened his eyes. Staring at him in Hari's palm was Shirsue's eye with a tangle of gray threads hanging from it. Cool. Hari. Yes, Dad? You may have my best friend's eye on one condition. What's that? Tell me how you got it. All right. Hari wondered why his father had described the root as Shadow ANBU. It wasn't like they were hard to find or anything. Right on the other side of 6 false walls, and there they were. It was nice being home. His eyes worked normally here. He'd gotten tired of being as blind as normal people. For the first time, Hari was thankful to Tracy for her gift. He slipped up behind a root ninja and stabbed her in the back of the neck. Well, it was actually the back of her skull, because she moved at the last moment. He needed to work on his stealth. He whistled a cheerful tune as he stripped her and donned the root gear. He placed the no mask on his face, and it morphed into the features of the dead ninja. She had been about his age, so his height wasn't going to throw people. He placed her mask on his face and walked to the entrance to the base he'd spotted earlier. The red hand hangs from the tree. The sentry's voice was dull. But the roots are where shadow thrives. Hari's skill at reading lips meant he'd seen this exchange twice this morning and knew the passcodes. Report to Lord Danzo, 731. Hari nodded silently and entered the base. As he walked, he noted points of interest. There were so many curious places. The fun part of any infiltration mission was knowing that once you were inside a secure area, people assumed you belonged. He had expected more from the scary man, but he was beginning to believe that people grossly overestimated danger. They even had an armory down here, with crate upon crate of explosive tags. He was willing to bet that these people weren't supposed to have those. The mess hall had a dozen ninja in it, eating in unison. It was as far from he was used to as possible. His family ate on their own or as a collective argument. It had been an easy transition in some ways to his school. This was creepy. There were so many places to stop in it that it took him almost an hour to find his way to the office of the man who sat in the center of the web of corridors. He considered trying to impersonate his dead cover ninja, but his eyes revealed that Danzo had an implanted eye in his head. It was active like his father's sometimes was. That wouldn't do. The copy ninja of Leaf got to have one because it was given to him. This man told no one. Hari seethed quietly. Stolen from his family. Hari unsealed the invisibility cloak from his wrist and wrapped himself in it. He waited for someone to enter the office and slipped in, crouching in the corner and amusing himself by reading the scrolls. They were in code, but it was fun to try and guess what they said. More interesting was unraveling the mystery of Danzo's arm. He'd had a lot of practice over the past 10 months at reading seals and so on. He was still pants at it. Hari lay in wait until the ninja left the room and Danzo was focused on reading some scroll. Hari slipped around in front of the man and his fingers jabbed out, punching into the old man's skull and snapping back, yanking the stolen eye from his face with a tangle of, "Were those gray?" The man screamed and reached for his bandaged arm, unraveling the wrappings, and revealing a gray arm with a red Sharingan slowly opening. And so, I ripped his arm off, but he was screaming a lot, so I made him quiet. By made him quiet, I cut his belly open, rammed a pair of senbon into his lungs and another into his heart. I sliced every artery I could get to, and stuck a kunai though his remaining ion into his brain. Hari paused. And I cut his head off, to be sure. Itachi's eyes closed again. You just horribly mutilated and murdered one of the elders of Leaf. Yep. Kisame was laughing so hard he fell off the log he'd been sitting on. You just killed the former head of Leaf's ANBU. Head of Root. He clutched at his stomach. Dear gods, you've probably caused more chaos in the village than anyone, since 2 weeks ago, when Orochimaru attacked it. I didn't just kill Danzo. Oh gods. Itachi grimaced. What else? Well, they had all these explosive tags in their armory. I have a horrible feeling. So, I planted a crate's worth throughout the base while they began a recall of agents to search for the attacker. There was a glow on the horizon despite it being early afternoon. And you blew up Root. And I blew up Root. Kisame had tears pouring down his face as he laughed. Ow. Itachi had just kicked him in the shins. So, about the eye? I really shouldn't let you have it. It's dangerous. You promised. I did not. You were going to. This is true. Itachi. Kisame was sitting up now. What? You gave the kid a pair of Byakugan. When he was younger than 2. I think we can manage an upgrade. I'm going to regret this. Yay. The attack on Leaf had been the last straw. Uchiha Sasuke had always been a loner, although it was getting harder and harder to manage with a certain blonde annoyance on his team. Still, he enjoyed solitude, even if he was slowly learning to cultivate solitude inside since outside was a constant stream of thought. On the other hand, he'd never really been alone in his life. He was followed by the ghosts of the dead all the time. No one in Leaf saw Uchiha Sasuke, they just saw the last Uchiha. It was pretty much expected of him that he would be the one to kill his brother and redeem his clan. He wasn't clear why they needed redeeming, as far as he knew, being murdered wasn't usually a criminal offense. Sasuke was pretty knowledgeable about the laws of Leaf, given that his family had been the police force. He'd made it his business to study them as part of their legacy. Excepting one orange idiot, everyone saw the Avenger of the Slain or something. And he did hate his elder brother. It was easy to hate him. The murder of his family was actually the least of the crimes he'd committed. Since Sasuke had never met them, he had no real sense of loss when it came to his family. On the other hand, leaving him without parents in a village that saw him as a thing instead of a person? That was something he could hate the man for. His only hope for peace had been that he would make Chunin and get to Dali there. It had always been a distant dream, since he was always under pressure to be the best and show that Uchiha were at the top. He didn't understand why so many civilians felt that it was important that he be great, but he felt a drive to manage it, if only to get them to leave him alone. His hopes had been dashed during his doomed mission to Wave. He'd seen the closest thing he had to a friend, and wasn't it a sad thought that Uzumaki Naruto was the only thing that resembled a friend for him? Go down with needles in his flesh and his eyes had bled, and then the world has skewed and gone out of sync with his body. Seeing the future had been a rush, but without time to practice it, it had nearly gotten him killed. It had been enough to stun him, and while he was out cold after getting turned into a pincushion, apparently Naruto had gotten annoyed about things and nearly killed someone. Or something. It was nice that someone was upset that he was dead, not just the Uchiha. The Chunin exams had been a total disaster too. Getting caught by Orochimaru in the Forest of Death had only been the beginning of that mess. He'd been under orders to maintain the Sharingan as much as possible to build up his endurance, so he was having to learn to constantly see the world at a different speed than reality operated. That had meant he hit a lot of trees in that god's-forsaken hellhole. The contradictory orders of not using chakra and using his Sharingan hadn't been cleared up, so he'd continued to use his bloodline, even as he avoided all other techniques. It meant he was constantly exhausted and strained from learning to handle the precognition of his immature Sharingan. And hadn't that been a kick in the teeth too? He had the misfortune of unlocking his clan's coveted bloodline, and apparently people weren't satisfied because it wasn't the full form or something like that. Since no one had bothered to tell him these things, it had been a bit of a shock when he found out that they wanted more. His teacher had been singularly unhelpful in that regard too. Since the man's eye was borrowed and he'd not been on good terms with Sasuke's family, the man knew nothing about the Sharingan. He had no doubt that Hatake had been assigned to him with the plan that it would somehow help with his own bloodline. Joke was on someone else, then, since the man's only answer was no idea. The invasion had been horrible. He'd had to face that monster and felt the same sort of bone-melting terror that Sabuza, and then Orochimaru had forced into him. His teammate, on the other hand, always took that chilling fear as an insult, treated it as a challenge. Sasuke was resolved to never again freeze when his ally was running headlong at something that dangerous. He was hoping his teacher would manage to help with that at least. But now, he had heard that Itachi was involved in this attack on Leaf. He had little love for his home village, but Naruto did. Since his friend, he was still working out if Naruto was his friend or just someone he tolerated, was out of town, he nursed the anger so that it would be fresh for Naruto to pick up when he got back. Itachi's presence meant that people were looking at him again, muttering and wondering when he would be ready to face his brother. The cursed mark on his neck was constantly flaring in pain despite the seal on it. The last straw had been finding out that his brother was looking for Naruto. Kakashi let it slip when he was sitting vigil over the injured Jonin. Again, he felt no real connection to the man, despite the silver-haired ninja's attempts to build bonds. But Naruto cared, and Sasuke knew that Naruto would give him grief if he didn't sit by his commander until Naruto got back to actually care about him. He couldn't let his brother get Naruto. There were precious few people who liked Uchiha Sasuke for himself. At the moment, Sasuke was sure of exactly one. If his brother was hunting the only person who actually cared about him, then he had to do something, and he had to do it now. Casual questions about the status of Naruto got him enough to go on, and he took advantage of the fact that his team was stood down while its teacher was recovering. All that led to this, a 1,000 birds crackling on his hand as he ran down a hallway, feeling the desperate rage clawing at him as he screamed. Itachi. And suddenly, someone was holding him from behind. Hi, Uncle Sasuke. Chapter 16, Conclusions and Skydiving Why They Shouldn't Mix. Uncle what? Sasuke was distinctly aware that he had someone hugging him from behind. That was not what he'd been expecting when he headed out to confront his brother. And the commentary had sent his brain into short circuit as he tried to follow it. Holy fuck. Naruto was standing against a wall with Kisame standing over him. Where the hell did that one come from? From his perspective, it looked like his best friend was currently being cuddled by a junior member of the Akatsuki, what with the cloak and all. Hari. Itachi's voice was that of the long-suffering parent. Why are you hugging my brother? Because he's family? Hari paused. Oh right. Hari. Put the kunai down. Sasuke had felt the point of a kunai against his throat as the person behind him began to radiate the most disturbing killing intent he'd had the misfortune of being exposed to. Where others' auras of menace had made him terrified of his own death, this had been the sensation of someone who was killing him because it seemed like a good idea at the time. Good point, Dad. Stabbing him in the kidneys will make it take longer. Familicide should be savored. Now the weapon was pricking his side. This wasn't really much of an improvement. No, Hari. His brother was talking to the weirdo hugging him, it seemed. You're not to kill him. That was an interesting development. Then again, he figured if his elder brother wanted him dead, he'd never have made it to toddlerdom. But isn't that what I'm supposed to do with family? What was wrong with this freak? No. You did. You can't kill him. That was acceptable. You got a whole clan. I just want this one. What? He's not strong enough. Hey. So, I should gut him now then. The knife was beginning to press against skin through his clothes. Why were they discussing this? Sasuke tried to move his arms, but that was a firm grip he was in. No. But you taught me that I should kill them when they're weak. A fair lesson, admittedly. And very Uchiha. From what Sasuke had gathered, not from civilians who had the strangest investment in the greatness of the Uchiha for some reason, by reading scrolls in his family's compound, the Uchiha had been much pretty the most poisonous bunch of backstabbing horrors as he could ever be glad not to have been raised by. It wasn't that Sasuke liked children, because he despised the little snot machines and D-ranks had done nothing to change that position, but he had the idea that children were supposed to have more parenting than being told how to hold a kunai and being terrorized to awaken a rare bloodline. The Uchiha didn't agree. I want him to get stronger first. That's stupid. A sentiment that, however Uchiha, Sasuke had to echo. Except that it was in reference to him. Wait. I'm not weak. Hush, Uncle Sasuke. I'm talking to my dad. What? Itachi's mouth opened, but Sasuke beat him to the punch. Hold on. What's with this uncle thing? Your brother is my dad, duh. Did the person with a blade at his kidneys just say duh? This was officially approaching the most humiliating experience of his life. Naruto's lip lock with him still took first place, but it was a near thing at this rate. He was going to regret asking this question. He just knew it. How old are you? I'm going to turn 12 this month. Sasuke looked at Itachi. Everyone watched as his lips moved in some rapid calculation. Oh gods. That's sick. Itachi blinked. Somehow the conversation had rather gotten away from him. What? You were 11 when you sired him? Sasuke shuddered. He'd known his family hadn't been nice people, but breeding 11-year-olds? Suddenly, the whole mass slaughter thing was making some more sense. Everyone said that Itachi had been a genius and perhaps he'd taken it badly. You know, suddenly, I understand why you killed everyone. What? Itachi was slowly looking around, trying to find who was hiding and laughing at what had to be some kind of prank. He'd suspect Hari, but his son wasn't usually inclined to this kind of joke. I'm so sorry for what happened to you, Sasuke said. I'm not sure I can go through with killing you. You had good reason. What? Itachi tried to dispel the illusion and found that there wasn't one. His eyes spun into kaleidoscopic Sharingan as he tried to see through it. What in the hell had gone wrong with the world? You were forced to have sex with a cousin. Thank the gods our sister was stillborn when you were 11. Sasuke's reading in the family archives had been distressingly enlightening. The Uchiha had always kept things in the family to try and breed the Sharingan true. He turned a bit to address the person holding him at kunai point. You know that's not okay, right? What in the name of all that is holy are you talking about? Snapped Itachi. I understand why you killed the clan after that. Hari is adopted. Itachi snarled. I killed the clan to test my powers. Sasuke angled his head and saw the swirling kaleidoscopic Sharingan gleaming in his captor's eye. Right. Sure. That was why Itachi's son had awakened some sort of mutant evolution of the family's prized eyes at age 11. It must have been so horrible that he repressed the memories of everything involved and convinced himself that his son was adopted. His family was so fucked up. When he rebuilt it, he would have Naruto advise him on how to make a clan that wasn't so screwed up. Kisame had stopped towering over Naruto and was now using him to stay upright as he laughed. Naruto meanwhile had tears pouring down his face as he realized his best friend's brother had been so horribly treated. He'd always felt bad for Sasuke because his family was dead, but it was sounding like that might have been a good thing. How awful. Hari looked up. Oh. What oh? Itachi was grateful that he was going to be able to pretend that didn't just happen for a bit. Your distraction turns out to have not worked at all. What? The target used the time to summon a Oshit. And then the wall exploded. In the wreckage stood a giant man as large as Kisame, wearing bright red and a forehead protector with oil written on it. Never fear. The gallant Jiraiya is here. He was standing on a toad and began a little dance. Women love me and... Hey! I know you. And Conan loves your books. Men want to be, what? My aunt back in Rain has your whole collection in her underwear drawer. Sasuke blinked. Why did his nephew know the contents of his aunt's panty drawer? When did he get an aunt? Oh gods, given that story about the boy being adopted, that was probably his nephew's mother and it was his aunt. Dear gods, did she live? I'm always glad to find out about Fan. Did you say Conan? Yeah. In Rain? Yep. What she looks like? Talish. Blue hair. Likes paper. She's really pretty. My Uncle Haydn says the paper cuts would be worth it to wreck that. Of course, he only says it when she's not around. Sasuke's eyes had bulged out and his Sharingan was activated, beginning to grow to the third stage as his horror at his nephew's life mounted. Was Itachi planning to mate his son with their sister? Hari. Itachi's voice cut in. What? What part of operational security did you not learn? Operation? You said we were going on a trip. Screw this. Kisame, we're leaving. Aren't we supposed to grab the power of human sacrifice? The hell with that. We're leaving. The Sharingan enhanced glare was enough to convince Kisame. Wait. I want to get an autographed set for Aunt Conan. Hari. Itachi followed Kisame out a hole the huge shark man knocked in the wall. He turned. If you could send a set to Aunt Conan, God's Tower, Rain, I'd appreciate it. Damn it, Hari. Coming, Dad. Hari jumped out after his father. Okay, said Jiraiya. What in the flying fuck just happened? No idea, horny toad sage. You little brat. Dad? Yes, Hari? Are you mad at me? Why would you think that? You look kinda like Professor Snape right now. Itachi sighed and stopped his running to walk over to a tree and bang his head against it a few times. At least you drive your teachers as crazy, he muttered. No, Harry, I'm not mad at you. Just frustrated. Why? My brother seems to have decided not to kill me. Oh. Harry paused. And? The modifications to his haircut meant that his left eye was now visible, 4 points whirling around. Nothing, nothing. Sasuke was glaring at his bowl of broth with noodles in. Thanks to he was beginning to suspect that Naruto qualified as his best friend. And his only friend. He really needed to see about expanding his social circle. The past week had been an unpleasant one. Despite the cheers from the idiots who saw it as some important thing that he unlocked the third tier of the Sharingan, he had spent his time going through more and more of his family's records. He'd read what there was before, but he was going over it with the jaded eye of a ninja, even if he was brand new. It had been nauseating stuff. If it hadn't required a Sharingan to find, most of the records would probably have been gone. Sasuke had burned them after he read them this time. His Sharingan memorized them for him. He needed to rebuild his clan for sure now, if only to make sure that the Uchiha had a legacy in the village other than spite and incest and treason. Hadn't that been an unpleasant awakening? Reading between the lines, this time able to remember all the other bits he'd read, and looking at it with the paranoid eyes of someone who'd fought for his life as a ninja, his family had been planning something bad. He didn't know when or what, but it had almost certainly been treason, judging from the fact that these would have been innocent scrolls that could have been left for anyone to find them. The only reason to hide them was that they had a darker interpretation. And that was to say nothing of the family tree he'd uncovered 2 years ago by asking in the office of records in the Hokage's tower. The Uchiha had been very closely knit indeed. The worst of it was finding that there was a third sibling under his parents' names. Kiko was recorded as having been a stillbirth. It sickened him to realize now that his parents had hidden away their daughter from the world to use her for breeding. He felt bad for his older brother. He'd no doubt been trying to protect their sister from further horror. But that didn't excuse the mass murder of the children. Itachi was a rabid monster, and it fell to him as family to put it down. It wasn't Itachi's fault, but it needed to be done. Sasuke needed power, and he needed it fast. Itachi was the last of the Uchiha's legacy of madness. He and Konin Kiko. Sasuke needed to erase the stain of his family from history, wipe out the two remaining memories of those disgusting kin. Only then could he build the clan anew on the ashes of the old. He would definitely be adopting Naruto into the family. The blonde might not carry the blood of the Uchiha, a bit of a plus in this case, but his influence would hopefully result in a clan of nice, mildly crazy ninja instead of violent, incestuous ones. Hey, dumbass. Naruto glared at his best friend, although without much hatred. It was hard to be angry at him right now, what with what they'd learned about his family. Besides, he'd managed to find the old hag and talked her into becoming Hokage. He was riding pretty high. And Sasuke didn't mean it, anyway. We need to talk. The blonde ninja joined his best friend at the gates of Leaf, ahead of the two sages who were having a squabble. Naruto wasn't following the whole thing, but he was pretty just it had to do with the pervert and attempting to grope the granny lady. It was funny to watch the powerful sage cringe in fear when his teammates screamed at him. You heard what my brother said, right? Sasuke wasn't looking at his friend, just staring ahead. His eyes were narrowed and they weren't their usual black, the Sharingan gleamed. Yeah. Naruto had been sad to hear that someone had a worse childhood than him, Gaara notwithstanding. And the scale of how bad it was. I need to rebuild my clan. Oh, bastard. Naruto jumped back several feet. I know that there was that incident in the academy, but I'm not into guys. Sasuke's head snapped up to look at Naruto so quickly that the people with them flinched as the cracking sound echoed. What? You want to rebuild your clan with me? Yes. I don't swing that way. Sasuke closed his eyes and sighed. Nor do I, Naruto. Oh. Good. Pause. I'm not using sexy technique. Good gods. I do not want to have sex with you. The silence from the three behind Naruto was deafening. Princess? What? Did I just hear what I thought I heard? I'm not drunk enough to have imagined it. Oh. I'm not sure that's any better. You idiot. Sasuke had Naruto's collar in his hands. I'm not asking to sleep with you. I want to adopt you into the clan. Because I like Sakura and what? Wait, you'd be my dad. No. Sasuke closed his eyes again for a moment. As a sibling. But I don't have the Sharingan. A sigh. This is true. But there are things about the clan that, well, I can explain once you're a member. But let's just say that I want to add some new blood. Naruto was silent, but there were tears forming in the corners of his eyes. It was one thing to have friends, but someone who wanted to be family? Even if it was the bastard who was his best friend. It was amazing just how fast paperwork like that could get dealt with when the Hokage happens to like you. Despite the hubbub of getting a military dictator sworn in and arranging for various reorganizations necessary after a major catastrophe, the Hokage had found time to sign the papers that allowed the adoption of Uzumaki Naruto into the Uchiha clan, as well as waiving the usual waiting periods and several other conveniences that made life easier. There also hadn't been much in the way of objection. Sasuke had wondered about that until he'd had a chance to talk with the new Hokage. She had bluntly informed him that it was because there was a 90-day grace period during which objections could be raised, and so she had accidentally failed to mention the adoption at all and was planning to forget about filing the paperwork in the records department for the next 4 months. At least. She confided that she was likely to leave it off longer than that in a drunken stupor because of Naruto. He had said he completely understood and only wished that Leaf allowed underage genin to drink. Naruto was uncomfortably sitting at the Uchiha clan table. It was used for formal clan meetings, which meant it had gone unused for almost 13 years. Prior to that, it had been pretty much in a state of constant occupation. The Uchiha liked their formalities almost as much as the Hyuga. Now it had handwritten notes scattered on it. Most of the details weren't committed to paper, but locked in Sasuke's head. For the last 2 hours, he'd gone over the details of what he knew. And that's why I brought you in. I can't imagine any spawn of yours managing to be that kind of messed up. With any luck, you'll balance it out. Naruto was pale. He hadn't realized what he was getting into. On the upside, Sasuke seemed to pretty much think that most of his clan's traditions could burn. But still, they were fucking crazy. It was shocking his best friend wasn't a bigger asshole than he was. But before we can work on that, we need to erase the last remains of the old ways. Itachi is a mad dog that makes it our responsibility to deal with him. I can only assume that my sister is similarly damaged at best. At best, she'll be catatonic. Either way, they need to die. He paused. We will have to hope that you can work your magic on our nephew. Come again? I want you to punch him in the face and tell him you want to be friends. What? It worked on Gaara. And Niji. And the new Hokage. And Kiba, come to think of it. Oh, and that brat in Wave. You mean Inari? Yeah. Sure. So, you're in charge of getting him sane again. Oh. Think of it like this, Naruto. He's been horribly abused and tormented, and could really use a friend and a welcoming family. Believe it. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.